I'd like to introduce our keynote tonight. Dr. Tyler Cowen is the General Director of the Marcatus Center at George Mason University and the Holbert C. Harris Chair of Economics at George Mason University. He also serves on the Marcatus Center's Board of Directors. He worked until 1989 as an assistant and as an associate professor of economics at the University of California, Irvine, and then returned to George Mason, where in 1998 he was named General Director of both the Marcatus Center and the James M. Buchanan Center for Political Economy. In 2000, Dr. Cowen was named the Holbert C. Harris Chair of Economics. A dedicated writer and translator of economic ideas who often delves into the economics of culture, Dr. Cowen has published dozens of books, reviews, and articles. His recent books include Create Your Own Economy and Discover Your Inner Economist, as well as a co-authored textbook series from Worth Publishers, Modern Principles of Economics, Macroeconomics, and Modern Principles of Economics, Microeconomics. He contributes frequently to the New York Times and Money, and serves on the advisory boards of both the Wilson Quarterly and American Interest. Dr. Cowen's previous books include Good and Plenty, The Creative Successes of American Arts and Funding. So with that being said, please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker for the evening, Dr. Tyler Cowen.
Thank you for the very kind introduction. He left out the most important element of the biography, and that is I was one of the first members of Students for a Libertarian Society in 1979. And that was a great group, but it was different from this group in two ways. First, all of SLS, as we then called it, not just the people who showed up, but all the people, were fewer people than are in this room right now. That's a big difference. They also only had like 1 or 2 women in Students of the Libertarian Society back then, and that's another big difference. So it's very heartening for me to be here and see as many people here as there are, and of course there are many more of you out there in different ways. I thought what I'd talk about today is my take on the history of liberty, past, present, and future. Where we've been, where we are, and where we're headed. And I'll also add a few remarks on my newest book, which came out just 2 weeks ago. That's called The Great Stagnation. And I would encourage you all to buy it. It's ebook only. So it's an innovation. It's a short book. It's only $4. You don't need a Kindle to read it. You can just go to Amazon, turn it into a PDF. There's a lot of different ways to buy the book. But looking back to the history of liberty, I have a pretty simple, I guess, economist's notion of how human history works, and that is, I think technology matters a lot, and I think predation matters a lot. And those are both libertarian themes. I see technology mostly as a positive. I see predation mostly as a negative. But technology sometimes becomes a negative because technology also helps predation. It doesn't just help production. So human history is a kind of race between these forces of technology and predation. To just leap over hundreds of thousands of years, I'll sum it all up by saying for a long time things weren't that good, basically. And then if you believe Greg Clark's work on the Industrial Revolution, you get to something like 1620 in England and in the Dutch Republic. And for the first time, probably the first time ever, we have some sustained economic growth. Most of all in England. But it's only a little more than 1% a year, starting in about 1620. And I think there are 2 favorable developments going on. The first is technology is getting a little better, so we're moving slowly toward an industrial revolution. And the second is that predation, at least temporarily, is constrained. England is an island. It has a strong navy. They predate on other people. That's not nice. They're like nasty to some of the colonies, but within England there's a reasonable amount of liberty. So you start getting some growth, and this will then blossom into a much higher standard of living than people had in the past. So you go to the 18th century, there are the beginnings of a consumer society, And then typically historians fill in this arbitrary period, like 1760 to 1830, that's the Industrial Revolution. Looking back at all that in terms of the history of liberty, I think a few points need to be made. The first is, in the 18th century, a lot of the 19th century, there really is a lot of liberty in the libertarian sense. That is, governments aren't that powerful yet. And yet there's enough technology that markets are somewhat free. It's not medieval times, you don't have serfdom, a lot of trade barriers have fallen away, mercantilism is on the wane. But that said, I never look back at those early times and think of them as any kind of libertarian paradise. First, they're much poorer. Second, they have kinds of tyranny much worse than anything we have today, such as slavery, or the treatment of women, or the treatment of colonies. So they're not really libertarian. I think of them as ages with some libertarian aspects. And one reason they're so free is not that there's so much sympathy for libertarian ideas, but just there wasn't enough technology to have a very large government. So I sometimes jokingly call it government by ox cart. They didn't have systems of taxation, oppression was hard, the early 19th century railroads were not widespread, so government was necessarily small. And essentially, starting after, say, the Civil War in this country, we move into the modern age, and we set off something unprecedented in human history, and that is this notion of a race. It's a race between technologies of freedom, production, the flush toilet, electricity, the radio, iPad, whatever. Lots of amazing stuff. But it also creates technologies which encourage predation. So there's modern bureaucracy. Governments keep files on people. They figure out how to tax us, how to regulate us. So government gets much bigger. A lot of classical liberals portray this as some kind of intellectual battle that was lost. That's very different from my perspective. I tend to see really technology is more important. And if you trace, like the history, when do corporations start getting big? It's the late 19th century. Railroads, canal companies, trading companies, then U.S. Steel. When do governments start getting big? Same time, late 19th century. So what really happened is technology exploded. We had enormous growth. Growth of corporations, growth of education, also growth of governments. In my opinion, that was in some sense always in the cards. I think of most people as intrinsically somewhat statist for biological reasons. I love Dan Klein's paper. He calls it the people's romance. It's online. You can read it. So people have always had this collectivist yearning. It was originally in the form of tribalism, and it ended up being in the form of what we now call statism. So America gets this new technology, it gets big government, it gets big markets, it gets a big military, it gets a lot of stuff at somewhat different paces, but I tend to think of it as one big event, call it the lots of stuff event. Some of the stuff we love, some of the stuff we hate, some of the stuff we have mixed feelings about. We also get working police forces, which has an upside, it has a downside. So that's really the main event in the history of liberty, I think, is what I call the lots of stuff revolution. And in this country, I pinpoint it as starting around 1870. And if you look at data on productivity, on innovation, on invention, the latter part of the 19th century, that's really when the Industrial Revolution starts to matter. That whole period in the history books, like up to 1830, progress was actually slow. But when you get electricity, when you're really taking advantage of the steam engine, when you're really combining fossil fuels with advanced machines, that's when human standards of living just skyrocket. And I think of the period from about 1870 to 19 whatever, maybe middle of the 20th century, it's the period in human history where the most stuff changes the most quickly. The most progress, but also the largest, most extensive, most brutal mass murders. You have Stalin, you have the Holocaust, there's Chairman Mao, some terrible stuff. The lots of stuff also included lots of predation. So this is a period we should all have very mixed feelings about. But that said, as a take it or leave it proposition, I think it would be hard to think, oh, we'd all be better off if things were as they were in 1810. Overall, it's a transition that, in my view, had much bigger gains than losses. In my book, The Great Stagnation, I call this the period of low-hanging fruit. So during this period, libertarianism as an ideology, it's pretty much routed, it's destroyed, it loses. The classical liberals have to free Europe. They come to the United States. They're met with cold indifference. Mises has to teach some screwy arrangement at NYU. There's statism and Keynesianism, and a lot of negative intellectual trends. But that's it. Government, like as a share of GDP, in some ways, you know, you'd love to go back to that. But anyway, all that technological progress slows down a bit, and we come to what I call the age of the great stagnation. That is, progress continues. Each year, most people are better off. There's market growth. There's also a lot of government. But the rate of revolutionary developments declines. So if I think of my grandmother, she was born in 1905. When she was born, people didn't have flush toilets, electricity, radio, cars. Well before she died, all these things were commonplace. Almost everyone had them. Huge changes in her life. I'm now 49, born in 1962, and other than the internet, there have not been comparable huge changes in my life. So that rate of growth has slowed down. And that is in essence what I consider to be the kind of second era or second period of liberty. We've seen slower growth, fewer revolutionary transformations, and what we've seen, in the United States at least, is precisely because growth is in some ways slower, people start deregulating and liberalizing and cutting taxes. When you look in the numbers, they may be off a bit, but in the numbers the slowdown seems to start about 1973. And the 70s were a terrible time economically, a lot of the 70s. I grew up in the late 70s, I tell you, I was terrified. I was a little kid. I did not remember the apparent or assumed prosperity of 1968. I was like watching baseball on TV, but I sure do remember 1978-79, the price of gold soared. Oops, that's today, it sounds familiar. Prime interest rates were at 20%. People thought the American dollar was going down the tubes. People thought we might approach hyperinflation. It was a terrible time. I picked up von Mises, that book, Planning for Freedom, and Mises told me that the reserve fund of interventionism had been exhausted, and that quickly all would come to an end because we had like run down our seed capital. And I'm like, help, I'm only 14. It's all come to an end. I want a job. But that was an overly pessimistic prognosis. It was incorrect. As things slowed down in the 70s and got worse, we had in this country, in England under Thatcher, in New Zealand, a bit later in Chile, and then a lot of countries followed. Of course, later was China, Eastern Europe. Most of the countries in this world had major liberalizations. Libertarian ideas have never really been that respected in the sense of libertarians, people with like the big L tattooed on their chest, have not necessarily been at those tables. But if you ask in that period, starting in like the late 70s, what are the ideas, not the people, but the ideas that have changed the world the most for the better? Mostly it has been libertarian ideas, this notion that's sometimes called neoliberalism. And most countries in the world now aspire to some version of capitalism, market economy, democracy, however imperfect that blend may be. It's a far cry from, say, 1944, 1942, 1946, 1948, when most of the world is a mess, or even 1965, when the developing world is completely a mess. Now, with some exceptions, you have most of the world pointed in a common direction. It's mostly a good direction. It's built upon classical liberal and libertarian ideas, however oppressed or frustrated we may feel when you like sit down at a campus coffee and hear claims about, whatever that make you want to tear your hair out. If you want to feel better, just ask yourself, like the last 35 years, which ideas have been in the ascendancy? It's ideas about a market economy, private property, and incentives. They have made billions of people much better off. And then we have what I call like the second period of liberty. The first period is like all the new technologies, the lots of stuff era. There's then like the slowing down of growth, in my book what I call the great stagnation. But you have a lot of reforms. Interestingly, the reforms are probably strongest in a lot of the most screwed up countries, like China had been, and they're weakest in what was the most successful country, which is the United States. So if you look at this country, we deregulated the airlines, we did like 20 other good things, but overall we've done a lot of bad things compared to the good things, and we haven't seen that much progress here. So we're in a strange position that this is the country with by far the greatest number of libertarians, and in a way the most sympathy for libertarian ideas, but also the least willingness to put them into practice. And that's true for foreign policy, it's true for imprisonment, it's true for the war against drugs, it's true for economic regulation. You look at healthcare, Canadians, Europeans, French, they think we have some kind of free market system. But if you look at per capita, like direct governmental subsidies, they are higher here than I think in any other system in the world, with the exception of somewhere like Luxembourg. They are very, very high here. We do not have free market healthcare. It is a bloated, overextended sector based on lack of accountability, bad incentives, massive third-party payment, massive and incorrect subsidization along many margins, and it is a total, complete mess, with higher subsidies and more regulation than most of the rest of the developed world. So in this country, don't clap, cry. In this country, it's pretty brutal. But what I see happening is that what I've called the second era of liberty, all these deregulations and tax cuts and a lot of catch-up growth from the rest of the world, not in other countries, but in this country, that's coming to somewhat of a close. And I think we're entering a third and very dangerous time, which maybe we could call the age of fiscal collapse. And even as recently as a few years ago, I didn't think this would happen to us. I thought we would find some kind of ugly statist bargain that, however inefficient it might be, would at least stave off fiscal collapse. And that may yet happen, but so far I don't see it. When I read the news, I follow fiscal issues pretty closely. It seems to be getting much worse, and the disconnect between what we spend and what we take in terms of tax revenue is growing. And that's not completely news, but the discourse on the issue is so terrible. So you look at someone like Paul Ryan, who is better than most politicians. I'm not blaming Paul Ryan here, but he gives an alternative State of the Union address about government spending, and he does not mention Social Security or Medicare. It's crazy. It's like talking about the Miami Heat and not mentioning LeBron James, Dwayne Wade, and Chris Bosh. You're not going to have a very good conversation, whether you're rooting for them or against them. And I don't mean to blame Ryan. The problem really is the voters. Republicans are cowards, but they're cowards for a reason. When you look at Republican attacks on Obamacare, the thing that really stuck and the thing that hurt the Democrats was the Republicans complaining that it would cut Medicare too much. That basically was it. And that's a very grim sign. If one wanted to complain that it's spending a lot of money in ways which screw up incentives and won't really make people very much healthier if it makes them healthier at all, and it will just like spend $200 billion a year to rearrange the order of people in the queue without solving any of the underlying problems of like supply quality, bad accountability, horrible results, medical error, and just this massive mess based on like legal licensing and barriers to entry and inability to have systems based on like information, accountability, transparency. Like if they had said that, I know that's a little hard, like on the evening news or even on like Rush Limbaugh or Fox. I don't know, I don't listen to that stuff. But at least it would have been right. But when the criticism is they're going to cut Medicare, you have to be pretty pessimistic, I think. I think fundamentally, in the United States right now, we are much poorer than we think from measured economic statistics. And I know this is a little different from the line one often hears from libertarians. I'm sure there's a lot of techno-optimists out there. There's books put out by Cato, op-eds in the Wall Street Journal, like how much better things are, like each year. But I don't anymore think that's true. And I think it's somewhat of a contradictory position. It's the main point I make in my book about the great stagnation. Until the last few years of my life, I always believed that. But there are enough numbers which are just sinking in. So the number that the left-wing people cite about stagnant median income since 1973, I think basically it's true. They don't point out that in Canada it's actually been worse. Like, you never hear that from Paul Krugman. It is worse in Canada. Since 1980, by one measure, median family income in Canada has gone up by $53. Now, you can argue about the numbers, the CPI deflator, and so on, but it's been a worldwide trend. Progress is slowing down. There are some great, wonderful things like the internet, but let's just take three sectors of our economy. Healthcare, we already talked about that, right? That's over 17%. It's huge, bigger than the economy of France. It's a total mess. When you count it in GDP statistics, how do we add it in? We add it in basically at cost. Spend a dollar, it's a dollar's worth of output. Nothing to do with does it make people healthier. We're valuing it at cost. Education. It's another highly regulated, isn't even the word. It's one of the most state-controlled sectors. K through 12 is a disaster. Higher ed can be pretty good. It's a very mixed picture, but I wouldn't call it a disaster. That's, 6 to 7% of the economy. And then there's that category, we call it government consumption, which actually is a fitting name. Like, only in the national income accounts do they call it what it really is. Like government consumption. Government consumes things it wants to do. On the evening news, they call it like, social welfare state. In the income accounts, more honest. Government consumption. That's like 21% of the economy. Now, there's some overlap with that and education and healthcare, so you can't just add all those numbers up. But just take like the defense budget. How do we add that into GDP? At cost. We spend a dollar, it's a dollar's worth of value. Like if you buy an apple for a dollar, how do we put that into GDP? Dollar's worth of value. But that makes sense. Why? You spend a dollar on an apple because an apple to you is worth a dollar. We spend a dollar on defense spending, counts as a dollar in GDP. Have we gotten a dollar's worth of value? Well, that's a big debate. I'm not going to go into it now, but probably some of you in this room here are a little skeptical, like about some of that spending, right? So you take like defense spending, a lot of education, a lot of health care, government consumption, the money they're spending on high-speed rail, which, whether you like it or not, it just won't be finished. It will be the classic white elephant, like Austrian business cycle theory writ large. It will not be finished. We're going to connect Orlando and Tampa. The last time I was in Orlando, I said, I really want to go to Tampa. But I can't make it. And I was stuck. But we'll actually never complete that line. So add all that stuff up. It's more than 30% of the economy. And that's not even considering a lot of the other areas where bad regulations, laws, taxes, whatever, have gotten their paws in. And part of what I'm saying is that is illusory wealth, a lot of it. Not all of it. Like some education works quite well. There are even some good government schools. But a lot of that is an illusion. We're over-measuring progress. We're over-measuring GDP. And our fiscal situation in this country is worse than we realize. A lot of us out there have what we call savings. It's a funny word now. We think of it as like private wealth. Like you have a money market fund. Let's say you have $30,000 in your money market fund. You think, I have $30,000. Even libertarians think this. But the reality is that that will have to be taxed for you to receive various benefits you or someone else is expecting. And what you think of as your savings, it's not really your savings at all. It's your savings right now. But the real value of our savings as a whole is much lower than we think, because we're treating these claims as private wealth and we're expecting the benefits, but we can't have both. Because again, we're spending beyond our means. So in my view, in the next 20 years, there will be some kind of systematic crack-up in this country due to fiscal issues. Spending too much relative to tax revenue. And I don't really have any prediction as to how it will play itself out. Here's another way to think about the problem, to put it in very stark historical terms. A lot of the modern state is really about old people. One reason governments used to be small wasn't just ideology, but go back to 1910. People don't live that long. It's not just infant mortality. Even if you survive being a small child, you die sooner, you never retire, you work your whole life. Medical care really can't help you much, probably on net. did more to damage your prospects than help them. So the notion of like Medicare in 1910, it made no sense. There was, if you broke a leg, they could set it like you were a horse or something. That worked. There was no penicillin. Most stuff didn't work. There was no medical care. There was hardly any retirement. You could be like a granny living at home. That was the extent of retirement. That worked fine, all things considered. But like Social Security and Medicare back then, Medicaid, they weren't really even coherent concepts. And we didn't have them. Look at the government budget. Where's the real money? Where's the growth coming over time? It is most of all Medicare. That's the budget killer. Then Social Security and also Medicaid. A lot more of Medicaid is spent on the elderly than a lot of people realize. So the three big items, and then interest on the debt, which is interest to pay for all that other stuff. Defense spending is a little separate, and other countries don't do it as much as we do, so put that aside for now. It's spending money on the elderly. Now, demographically speaking, what's the group most likely, not even likely, certain to increase in numbers over the next 20, 30 years in this country? The elderly. What are the elderly going to vote for? We'll see, right? But I have a simple theory. The elderly are going to vote for the elderly. I think it's a theory with good predictive power. But it means we are in a mess. Because elderly are politically active. They don't just vote. They donate money. They write letters. They go out and do all sorts of things. Sometimes in libertarian directions. That's great. But when it comes to limiting transfers for the elderly, in the short run, it's very hard to be optimistic. What I see again is some kind of train wreck coming along, and the resolution of that being very painful, but also a bit hard to predict. And like how that train wreck is resolved, we can think of as like the end of the third era of liberty. First there's the lots of stuff era, then there's the great stagnation era, then there's the, we head to an even bigger and badder financial crisis, which is probably in less than 20 years' time, depending when the bond market gets nervous. But that all said, I don't want to scare you too much. I am actually an optimist. It's a little strange for a guy who titled the book The Great Stagnation. I think techno-optimism is fundamentally correct. I just think people don't fess up enough to the lags. The numbers right now, we're over-measuring wealth, we're over-measuring progress. There are big breakthroughs, but when we got, say, electricity, there's some very good papers by Paul David. It took us really quite a few decades to turn electricity into everyday products that made everyone better off. It took a long time. And this is a recurring fact about economic history that we neglect, because we're used to things going like that. iPods come out. How many of you here like have never had an iPod? Probably not that many of you. It didn't take that long, and that's great. But a lot of change takes a long time. My view is that the internet will herald a real revolution, a real transformation. We will in some way build the American and global economy around it. It just hasn't happened yet. If you think of us, we've had the real internet for like 10 years, right? Oh my God, so fantastic, so amazing. You know, I read this blog, I buy on Amazon, whatever, Match.com, you know, what everyone does, Facebook, what everyone does on the internet. And you're like, wow, it will be uploads in 7 years. I'm like, hold on. The last 10 years, macroeconomically, have been the worst 10 years for this country since the 1930s. I'm not at all blaming the internet. That would be crazy. Not at all. But the point is, the internet, economically speaking, at the macro scale, has yet to make a really big positive difference. And in my view, that will take another 20 to 30 years. And that will like start off what I hope will be a kind of fourth era of liberty and historical change. It will be this enormous blast of new stuff, maybe accompanied by changes in the biosciences, in medicine, somewhere else. We'll get like education, healthcare, at least like partially accountable, easy to measure, stop spending money on the junk, like massive progress. It'll be led by information technology and by like the massive number of smart, intelligent, creative, ambitious people in the US and China, all over the world, and that will be great. But that's like the leapfrog story. We're still like on that sled going down the hill with a messed up, non-accountable, overvalued economy, total disconnect on the fiscal side, headed for a train wreck. So there's opportunity, but it's also pretty scary. In the rest of the world, the countries playing catch-up. They're all doing well. China has had phenomenal progress. Places like Brazil and Turkey, no one was sure they'd like make it cross over the threshold, but they have. It's very unlikely they go back to a lot of the nonsensical policies they had even 10 or 20 years ago. So most of the world, it's doing way better. Here in this country, we're headed for the fiscal train wreck. Right now, we're in the great stagnation, probably about to leave it for something a good bit worse. Looking forward a bit longer on to something a good bit better. And that, in a nutshell, is my take on the past, present, and future of liberty. Thank you all for listening.